How to negotiate an end to the Russia-Ukraine war. This is Castle Bravo. This is a 15 megaton thermonuclear explosion from the 1950s. It was the first deliverable hydrogen bomb using lithium hydrate, a solid material, as the explosive. It's one of the most powerful hydrogen bombs, thermonuclear weapons, ever detonated. Every day, as the conflict between Ukraine and Russia continues, with massive U.S. support for Ukraine, is risking a global thermonuclear war. Now, I've discussed in other videos how the conflict might escalate to a global thermonuclear war. It's a very real risk. This is probably the closest the world has come. It's the closest military conflict between Russia and the United States ever. Closer than the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which only one U.S. airman died. Already, tens of thousands of Russian soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers, perhaps hundreds of thousands have died. And the war has been dragging on for over a year. This is a risk neither Russia nor the United States should be taking, and could easily destroy both nations, and indeed even the entire human race under some scenarios, such as the nuclear winter scenarios. In this video, I'm going to talk about that old adage, good fences make good neighbors. How the two countries can negotiate an end which safeguards the security of Ukraine and Russia together without Ukraine joining either formally or effectively NATO. At this point, it's highly integrated with NATO in practice, through the use of fortifications, walls, other defenses, exchanged observers. I admit I'm not a military expert, and this is just a rough sketch or a rough draft, and an actual agreement would require the creativity and skills of strategic experts, military officers, and others to put an end to this terrible situation and the potential to destroy both countries and indeed humanity. So let's take a look at Europe and the situation in Europe. This is Kiev, or Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine. This is the border with Russia. This is Moscow, only about 500 miles from the border. And you can see here the Carpathian Mountains that cut through Romania that provide a natural boundary, which, as we'll see, is fairly lacking in Ukraine and Russia, a major source of the difficulties in achieving mutual security. I'm also going to start by talking about Czechoslovakia, which is now split into Czechia and Slovakia. This is because the situation bears many similarities to the conflict and confrontation in Czechoslovakia in 1938 that led to World War II. And the analogy to the infamous Munich agreements between the Nazis, Hitler, and Chamberlain is brought up constantly in every situation like this, and is being brought up. I want to show some of the similarities and also what Chamberlain and Hitler and other leaders at the time might have been able to do to end the conflict in Czechoslovakia at that time. And then we'll go to talking about Ukraine and how we might be able to set up protective walls and other measures in eastern Ukraine, southern Ukraine, to stabilize the situation in a relatively defensive way, somewhat like what happened in Korea, in such a way that Ukraine would not need NATO's explicit or even implicit protection, and they could count on those walls and defenses, hopefully, to hold without necessarily NATO coming to their defense. If NATO chickens out, they're still protected. Same way with Russia and Moscow. So let's go now a little bit back in time and look at the situation in Czechoslovakia in 1938, and I'll explain in a minute the parallels. So this is a different map that doesn't have English. This is Czechoslovakia right here, or Czechia today. This is Prague. Praha is Prague, and this, which was the capital, by the way, and is the capital of Czechia today, and Slovakia. So Czechoslovakia was a product of the Treaty of Versailles. It was very unstable. The Czechs and the Slovaks never got along, and significantly, part of what happened in the Treaty of Versailles was that pieces of Germany were ripped off from Germany and put into other countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia. It's a classic imperial maneuver that the British were very good at. Many of the imperial powers did this in Africa, often with long-term horrible consequences. There was a German minority that lived in the mountains here. So the natural boundary between Germany and Czechia, or Czechoslovakia, was the Sudeten Mountains. And these were heavily fortified by Czechoslovakia. So there were forts and military bases all through this area, even though nearly all the people living there at the time were German. And there was complaints of mistreatment of the Germans and all this kind of stuff. There's probably some truth to that. There's probably some of it may have been hyped by the Nazis, by Hitler. Hitler presented himself at this time, whether truthfully or not, basically as a champion of the Germans, and that he was going to essentially reunify all the German-speaking areas, as Bismarck and I forget the German king's name, had done in the 1800s. So an understandable goal, and one which, for example, this had been one of the goals of the liberal revolutionaries in Germany and Prussia in 1848, and Bismarck took it over as what a great idea, now I'll do it. So this wasn't an unreasonable situation, but there was a real problem. If Czechoslovakia handed over the Sudetenland, as they did, to Germany, the natural boundary was gone, the forts were gone, and the German military would occupy this area. And it was only like, at most, maybe 50 miles from these mountains to Prague. So, of course, 6 months later, when Czechoslovakia fell apart, the Slovaks and the Czechs were fighting, and presumably Germany was manipulating this, but I don't really know the details. I'm not sure anybody does. Anyway, it wasn't a very stable situation. So the agreement really just was a pause before the war broke out over Poland. And that's a whole big, long story. There are a lot of parallels to the situation in Ukraine, where you have a Russian-speaking minority in the south and east of the country. Unlike Czechoslovakia, as I'll show, there's no natural boundary like the Sudetenland between Russia and Ukraine, or at least it's a very feeble boundary compared to these mountains. What could they have done? What should Chamberlain and tried to do here? Maybe he did try and Hitler laughed in his face, but you never hear this, okay? They always never explain what Chamberlain should have done. It's just like, well, he should have started World War II over Czechoslovakia. That would have sold really well to the British and world population. He didn't. But they never explained, what could they have done as opposed to doing this? It's just always trotted out in these situations, often by both sides. I mean, Russia and Putin are fighting the neo-Nazi nut jobs in Ukraine. That's their line. And, of course, our line is that Putin is the new Hitler, right? He's this, terrible, awful guy. Everybody invokes the Nazis since World War II. The communists in Korea, in Vietnam, we're fighting the Nazis. The Americans are the Nazis. And the Americans were, this is Czechoslovakia again. We've got to draw the line in Korea or Vietnam or El Salvador or wherever. Okay, so let's try to get past this and think about this. What should they have done? Well, one thing they could have done is something like this. Largely demilitarize both sides of the border, retain the forts and other fortifications in the Sudetenlands under Czechoslovakian control. So there still would be soldiers, there would be people there. There would be observers from both Germany. The German observers would obviously be in the demilitarized zone in Czechoslovakia, and there would be observers or censors or what have you, along the border on the other side of Germany. All of the local administration, the police, mayors, all of this would have been either under an autonomous German subregion in Czechoslovakia or, make it part of Germany for most practical purposes, but not militarily part of Germany. The Germans could vote for the, whatever it was called, whatever the parliament was in Germany, which was pretty pointless, or the Nazis put in the party in Germany at that time. But either arrangement would be fine. So it would be in this kind of fuzzy area like the Commonwealth arrangement the U.S. has with Puerto Rico. I don't say this is the best solution in some sort of idealized utopian world where everybody's at peace, but in terms of meeting both requirements, it comes pretty close. The Germans have control over the police, the regulations, business licenses, all the kinds of things where the Czechs might have been picking on the Germans in the Sudetenland. Disputes over property lines, things like that, all of the things that would likely have produced friction between the groups in the German-speaking area. schools, all this kind of stuff. On the other hand, the militarily important defense line here would have remained under Czechoslovakian control. Something like that would have allowed a settlement of the dispute. Something similar could have been worked out with the German-speaking areas in Poland as well, which gave rise to the actual war. Significantly, nobody ever talks about those possibilities. Like, how could we work this out other than just going to war and slaughtering tens of millions of people? It's always either we, go to war, have this horrific war, or, the Holocaust, Hitler was so bad, etc. Everybody's the new Hitler. So that's a discussion of Czechoslovakia. Well, how does this apply to Ukraine? Well, Ukraine has a similar problem. This is a map from Wikipedia showing, and I think it's maybe skewed a little in favor of Ukraine or Ukrainian speakers. So the blue is supposedly Ukrainian-speaking areas, and red is mostly Russian. So you can see that there's Russian-speaking people here heavily in Crimea. This area here is Crimea. Well, maybe a more accurate map is this one from this guy here. So I recommend you check out the website here. And here's the Russians. And there's kind of a hybrid area in the southeast of Ukraine where there's people speak Ukrainians, people who speak Russian. It sounds like there's people, they're intermarried, all this kind of thing. So some people are bilingual, etc. And then there's the west, which is Ukrainian. And, of course, these other areas. So you can see we have a kind of a similar situation. We have a group here that's a minority group aligned with the Russians, a lot like the Sudetenland. And, of course, there's military and strategic goals, which, Hitler probably had too. So, like, there's the warm water port here in Crimea, which is a big deal for the Russians and has been for centuries. And, there's various, hidden agendas obviously going on here. We have had scandals here in the U.S. about what might be described as contributions to family members of our president from people in Ukraine, all that kind of stuff. So there's other agendas, but this is kind of the underlying cultural issue that's very, very similar, actually, to the conflict in Czechoslovakia in 1938. And, of course, as happens with all of these, the, Munich analogy, this portrayal of Chamberlain as caving into Hitler, has, of course, been invoked in this conflict by both sides. Both of them are fighting the Nazis, as if they weren't defeated in 1945 and largely destroyed. So let's think about the same issue. How do we defend the natural, Okay, so let's take a look now at the natural borders here. In contrast to the Sudeten Mountains, there just doesn't seem to be too much that's really good as a natural boundary. This is normally how countries have established stable borders and long-term peace between the countries. And I was trying to show briefly over here that's what the U.S. has in a lot of ways. So here's the Rio Grande, which is the border between the U.S. and Mexico. And if we, the U.S. is great for this. We have basically a big long river between Texas and Mexico. We have deserts and really inhospitable areas here. We have the Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean. We have a series of Great Lakes, all this kind of stuff between us and Canada. This is a pretty remote area here between the northwestern U.S. and Canada. So we have naturally very defensible borders, unlike some countries and unlike Ukraine. So coming back to Ukraine, there's the Dnieper River, which is already halfway into the country. It actually looks like it probably provides a natural border with these Russian-speaking areas down here along this area. But it doesn't look too great here. So again, here's the Carpathian Mountains, which undoubtedly provide a substantial potential natural boundary. But they're not very useful. There appear to be mountains or hills and other stuff between Ukraine and Belarus, but the problem is Russia. It's a problem for both sides because an army could, like the Nazis, could come through here, keep going, and go all the way up to Moscow. Yeah, here's Moscow. So they could come up around like here and hit Moscow in the future. Who knows? NATO, for example, could do it to liberate Moscow. There are some mountains and some rivers along here. They're pretty small, I would say. However, the basic idea would be that we build, we have modern technology. We can build walls. We can build watchtowers. We can do something similar to make up for the natural weaknesses. This isn't a new idea, by the way. Let me see if I can go here. So this is about the Russia-Ukraine border, and here we go. In 2014, the Ukrainian government unveiled a plan to build a defensive walled system along the border with Russia, named Project Wall. It would cost almost $520 million, take 4 years to complete, and has been under construction as of 2015. So that obviously didn't work. We have now spent in 1 year over $100 billion on offensive weaponry, killing at least tens of thousands and quite possibly hundreds of thousands of both Ukrainians and Russians. A fraction of that 100 billion could probably have built a much better wall than this thing would ever have been, right? So let's put it in perspective. Isn't it better to use that kind of money not to kill other people and make them angry and hateful and, leave families without their children, children without their fathers, all that kind of stuff that's going to live in people's memory for, generations? Shouldn't it be much better for us the U.S. and Russia, to agree to construct some kind of mutually defensible arrangements in this border region here that would make it ideally impossible, but certainly difficult for either side to attack the other. Ukraine does not need to be part of NATO to do that. They don't have to have offensive, missiles or things like that to do that. And Russia's in the same position. They can demilitarize to some degree, maybe very large areas like all of Ukraine. By demilitarize, I don't mean completely remove weapons. Actually, there'd be weapons. But you can pull back or remove missiles, fighter bomber aircraft, things of that nature, which could easily be used in an offensive capacity, and build up a more defensive system and allow both sides to have observers. Remember, this is how we actually disarmed in Europe between Reagan and Gorbachev, is that they exchanged on-the-ground observers to verify that the missiles were actually not there. Now, we can certainly do similar things to pull back these very offensive weapons and put in their place defensive fortifications, other measures. As I said, I am not a military expert. I'm sure there's a lot of details here. Some of my ideas may be totally off the wall, wouldn't work, but I'm sure the odds are pretty high we could come up with something that would do this. There's history to this. There's the Great Wall of China. There's Hadrian's Wall in northern England to keep out the Scots and the Picts. There's been examples throughout history where people have built walls and other defensive arrangements to maintain peace and to avoid getting into offensive wars and all of these horrible things that have happened throughout history. So let's not accept these forced conclusions that, Russia has to pull completely out, that, Ukraine can only have security with NATO. Who in their right mind is going to rely on the word of NATO to protect your country? Look at the messes they've gotten into in Serbia or Afghanistan. Look at this disaster in Afghanistan, which was sort of justified with some NATO language. Let's look at how we can establish physical security with walls and other protective measures, sensors, observers, all this kind of stuff to ideally make it very difficult or impossible for either country to cheat on a peace agreement. Something that, giving control of the Sudetenland with its fortifications to Hitler, obviously that didn't work, but that doesn't mean it's impossible to make it work, or that it was impossible to come to some arrangement in 1938 that would have avoided World War II and made it difficult or impossible for the British Empire or Germany or Russia to cheat, which is effectively what happened. So write to your congressman, speak up. The whole world, this is something, not just the U.S. and Russia, we are playing Russian roulette, if you like. We are gambling every day this continues with global thermonuclear war, the most powerful weapons mankind has ever created, which have the power to kill hundreds of millions of people in 30 minutes, and could possibly, through fires, nuclear winter, dust in the atmosphere, unknown physical effects. No one has ever used these weapons, in this way. I mean, we've had 2 of them detonated in warfare. Tiny. This weapon, Castle Bravo, is over 1,000 times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These hydrogen bomb weapons have been tested a handful of times. They have never been used in war, and they are way more powerful than anything that's ever been used in war. And yet we are gambling with using thousands of them to obliterate each other. Every day that the war in Ukraine and Russia continues, dragging on, killing thousands upon thousands of Russians and Ukrainians. For what? What is anybody getting out of this? Absolutely nothing. Just an enormous waste at a terrible, terrible risk. So write to the president, write to the congressman, speak to your neighbors, let people know, one, this is insane, crazy risk, and two, there are alternative ideas and solutions to this, to what is being discussed on cable TV or the mainstream media or many of these discussions that are occurring. This concludes this video presentation. If you like this video, please click like. Please click subscribe and the notification bell if you would like to receive more content from us. You can avoid internet censorship by subscribing directly to our RSS news feed. Please consider sharing the link by email and on your website or blog, in addition to liking, upvoting, or sharing on increasingly censored, advertising beholden, big company social media. We have encountered such censorship. Mathematical software is developing algorithms and software to automate data analysis, reducing the risks of costly errors and increasing the predictive power of the results. You can support our work financially by subscribing on our Patreon page, https://www.patreon.com/mathsoft, or scanning the QR code in the lower right corner.